That's why we wanted to bring some key experts, but also some key leaders of the business community together with the WTO. And thanks also for the WTO for joining us. We'll have also the Deputy Director General of WTO joining us. But the idea behind this exchange is also to launch some important initiatives in terms of follow-up, in which the business community can engage in a substantive manner also with the WTO, but all with other business organizations and also international organizations dealing with trade. I would like also to give a special thanks also to Maria Fernanda because of also the role that ICC has played also in trade initiatives, and we would like also to give her the first remarks also in this event. At the end of this launching, we'll have also the president of IOE, Michel Parmalee. She will be joining us also in order to show also the engagement of the entire community of IOE, our more than 150 business organizations in 140 countries. So without much delay, I would like to give the floor to Maria Fernanda. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll keep connected, we'll keep engaging also in terms of identifying follow-up action, which can be also very helpful also in order to change this narrative of trade integration. Maria, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this opportunity to join you today on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce, the institutional representative of the global real economy and principal interlocutor at the World Trade Organization. Warm welcome to all our distinguished speakers, and to congratulate the International Organization of Employers for launching this business coalition for trade, employment, and sustainable development. Today, more than ever, business must increase its engagement with the World Trade Organization, which presently finds itself in what can only be called a constitutional crisis. We all know, as political leaders have been repeating for the last 5 years, that all three elements of the WTO's operating model, oversight, negotiation, and dispute settlement, have broken down one after the other. At the same time, the WTO clearly must play a greater role in combating environmental sustainable challenges, especially but not exclusively climate change, and contributing to the sustainable developing goals of the global trading system. Because the reality is that without reform and a more robust contribution from the global trade body, the SDGs will remain out of reach and the WTO will sink into irrelevance. Businesses, as the end users of the trading system, cannot let that happen. Instead, leadership demands that we stop debating about the future of the WTO and instead start to build the WTO of the future, a WTO that works both for people and for planet. At ICC, that is our core institutional focus, which is why ICC has developed a paper called Global Business Priority for the WTO, which provides 27 concrete recommendations on how WTO members can deal with the 5 major issues facing the organization, namely, the need to finally address the underlying structural changes demanding reform, to meaningfully combat the many trade dimensions of the COVID pandemic, to write rules to enable the development of the digital economy, to boost the WTO's role in promoting sustainable development, and to do more to make the trading system more inclusive for groups traditionally disadvantaged or left out entirely. And it is why ICC has recently proposed, in collaboration with the WTO director and the B20 chair, and here I acknowledge my good friend Shinta Kamdani, the creation of a standing CEO advisory council that would provide regular advice on matters such as business priorities for new and ongoing trade negotiations, including on environmental sustainability. This would address the fact that despite business being the end users of the global trading system and the principal stakeholder in trade rules, remedies, and dispute resolution, the WTO does not have any formal structured means of business engagement. And finally, it is why ICC participates as a private sector representative in the trade and environmental sustainability structure discussions and have launched with the WTO the Trade Dialogues for Climate to allow business to speak directly and regularly with WTO ambassadors about how to better align trade and climate policy. So we welcome the launch today of the Business Coalition for Trade, Employment, and Sustainable Development, which will be an important complement to these efforts. And I am very thankful to IOE, to Michelle and Roberto especially, for inviting the International Chamber of Commerce to participate in this event. After all, the challenges in trade, sustainable development, and employment are so great that the global business community in all its forms and compositions must work even more closely together to ensure governments take meaningful action. And for that reason, ICC wishes you all the best with this initiative and looks forward to engaging in the future with all partners on this topic. Thank you.
Also to say that your leadership in ICC on issues related to trade will be very much helpful to us also. And I also take your words of complimenting all the work that you have been already undertaking with this also proposal that you have made also to improve the way WTO also is handling some of the important discussions that we have in FESO. But we will be more than willing also to make of this initiative also a good complement to your good presence and active presence in the WTO. I also want to say, and I don't want to be shy on that you are someone who is very known also for the IOE. You have been also coming with us to the many delegations that are gathering also the International Labour Conference in the ILO some years ago. So this link also makes you also quite a relevant profile for us in terms also of complementing each other. So thank you again for your time. Thank you also for waking up so early, and thank you for your commitment. We look forward also to be with you. In the program, we have also foreseen another important business leader, and you know that the B20 is a critical forum for us also to push the agenda of trade, but also to push the agenda of employment and inclusiveness. And for that reason, we had also the pleasure to count with us with the chair of the B20 that is going to be next year in Indonesia. And the B20 chair has apologized because in the last minute she could not join us in a face-to-face because also of timing issues, but he has sent us a kind of good video message that I want to share now with all of you.
Your Excellency Ngozi Ogojo-Iweala, Director General of the WTO, Michelle Parmeli, IOE President, Maria Fernanda Garza, First Vice Chair of ICC, Magia Reyes Maroto Elera, Minister for Industry, Trade and Tourism, Spain, Wesam Francis, Minister for Trade, Industry and Cooperatives, Uganda, Tim Yek, Associated Secretary for Trade Policy, Australia, fellow Business Association, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my perspective on behalf of B20 Indonesia presidency in the launching of the esteemed Business Coalition for Trade, Employment and Sustainable Development on behalf of B20 Indonesia 2022. The past year and a half of pandemic does not only shrink economic growth, but also shrinking employment and slowing job creation due to the market contraction and rapid changes in businesses due to forced accelerated adoption of technology and digitalization. Last month, ILO projected that on average, global hours worked in 2021 will be 4.3% below the pre-pandemic levels, compared to fourth quarter 2019, an equivalent of 125 million full-time jobs, whereby the biggest loss of total hour works happened in lower middle income countries, about 7.3%, and low income country, 5.3%. This projection is much more severe than its prior projection in June 2021, which forecasted only 3.5% or 100 million full-time jobs less than fourth quarter 2019. Although traditionally speaking, employment issues are of no trade concerns, and likewise, trade issues are of no employment concern among nations, there are reasons why employment issue in post-pandemic needs to be discussed along with trade issues to achieve a sustainable development. First, trade is a huge enabler to improve productivity, job creation, and sustainable economic development. Trade does not only amplify productivity by expanding market access, but also by facilitating investment, which is a prerequisite to job creation, improve industrialization, and skill transformation. Trade and employment policy need to align with each other to ensure that the greater productivity created by trade will manifest in employment creation and better distribution of welfare, as the desired trickle-down effect that trade should generate to achieve a sustainable economic development. Second, in pandemic context, retaining employment and job recreations are closely linked to countries' capability to control pandemic locally. Vaccines availability to countries and workers in need will be a key factor to retain jobs and expand jobs. Global coordination and trade cooperation to enable countries to mass produce and distribute vaccine plays a crucial role to ensure vaccines are adequately and readily available to countries and people in need, so they can retain as much job as possible and enable them to recreate job as soon as possible. Third, the nature of work has been changed significantly since the pandemic. Hybrid work and gig works are much more common than it was before. Thanks to rapid digitalization and accelerated technology adoption, people can work from anywhere in the world as long as their skills are recognized and needed. These are boundless job creation opportunities. If trade in services and global arrangement on digital trade would facilitate hybrid workers and gig workers to work across borders seamlessly, such as through MRAs on professional skills or greater facilitation to the free movement of people. Fourth, skills required in post-pandemic economic activities changes significantly as business community adopts technology more rapidly and integrate more deeply in economic digitalization. Technology 4.0 really changes the skill set required in employment. As trade facilitates the trade and adoption of technology 4.0, employment policy need to catch up the changes in skill set, shift of employment opportunities, and facilitating workers' mobility, which may have been caused by adoption of automation, Internet of Things, and others in business. Trade should also contribute to the means to utilize the technology to create productivity, primarily in developing countries, which are more severely affected by technology 4.0 rather than developed countries. This will be impossible if trade does not encourage cross-border trade and investment in education or trainings for reskilling, retraining, and upscaling of workers and other related services. Trade which may enable workers to earn the know-how to benefit from technology adoption at work or in the job market. Fifth, global market concern over environmental issues, economic sustainability, inclusivity, worker protection, human rights, and other social standards will be much more demanding across supply chain in post-pandemic global economy. While a strong observance environmental and sustainability standards may be of importance, countries also need to ensure that observance to such standards in global value chains and trade will not challenge countries to trade. Standards conformity across countries will be important in global trade as it is in global workers' protection. In the wake of so many private standards that are often made in silo by developed countries with limited mindfulness of development gap, yet being promoted as global standards that end up discriminate developing countries. Trade leaders need to ensure that employment standards and sustainability standards are made and imposed without discriminating and overburden developing countries and Msme to trade globally. 6. For most part of the world, the biggest generation of employment is Msme. The more Msme are empowered to tap into great economic opportunities, for example, through export or participation in global value chain, as the WTO members may have discussed in the informal working group on Msme, the faster employment will be created. The trade and employment indeed shared a common goal in our journey to ensure sustainable development and economic inclusivity. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the few things that B20 Indonesia perceives how employment and trade policy should be aligned and coordinated. B20 Indonesia is visioning a speedy global recovery, inclusive and innovative global economy which are created through global collaboration and coordination. Although trade may not have direct means in trade rules to maintain employment or create jobs, and employment regulations may not have direct relation to make trade more efficient or more inclusive, B20 Indonesia believes that trade rules should be made with a mindset to achieve economic inclusivity, better distribution of income, and sustainable development, whereby employment is one of the key factors. Likewise, employment policy should also be made with the mindset of meeting the challenges created by modern-day trade, complexity on employment, worker skills and competence, as well as their protection wherever or through whatever means they may be employed. I sincerely hope that this coalition will be a good starting point for public-private dialogue and collaboration to create better trade and employment policy coordination toward inclusive economy and sustainable development. I believe that if we are faithful to the goal of improving the well-being of people at large in a sustainable manner, as the SDG may have indicated, we can always find a way to arrange so that trade policy and employment policy can complement each other in creating the trickle-down economic effects that end up in the achievement of the SDG. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that we have to appreciate also the push also that the B20 presidency Indonesia is going to give also to this complementarity between trade policies and employment policies, which is linked also to the SDGs and to the inclusiveness that we are all looking forward after and during this pandemic. We are having our agenda also two important government representatives. One of them is the Vice Minister of Employment in Brazil, Mr. Bruno Dalcolmo, but I'm not sure that they have managed to connect right now. I don't know. I'm going to ask Monique whether we have already the minister connected.
No, not yet. I'm going to contact them.
Okay, then just to optimize our time, I will ask other important participant, I would say someone who has also been helping us and supporting us in many sense, who is also quite engaged in the area of trade and employment, and who is Phil O'Reilly from Business New Zealand. You have many hats, and one of them is now representing the approach of this area of the world. And I would like also for you to give our insight on how we could handle this new scenario, this new area in which trade policies, but also employment policies need to complement much better. Phil, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Roberto, and greetings to Deputy Director General Allard and Maria Fernanda. It's great to see you again, and other distinguished speakers and speakers from both government and from business, and all of those attending today. It's just early in the morning here in New Zealand, and another early morning for us on the Zoom calls into Europe. I'm particularly pleased and proud to represent Business New Zealand to help launch this important new initiative. There's a saying that all good things take time, and that's certainly been the case with this initiative. But when I look at how it's landed, the parties that are involved and the clear support that it has from the WTO, I think we've ended up in a really good space. Some of the thinking around this initiative started with the idea that there was a desire for employers' organisations to be far more deeply involved in matters associated with trade. In my view, it's obvious that employers' organisations and the IOE should be interested in trade and the multilateral trading system. After all, we've been talking about things associated with trade for a very long time in the context of labour, employment and social affairs. The evidence around trade is clear. If trade is to work for all, then countries need complementary policies which will enable the impacts of trade to be most positively felt now and in the future. This might mean, for example, making sure that workers are properly skilled to take part in the new jobs that are created by trade, or that we ensure that labour markets are appropriately flexible to take account of the increased dynamism in economies that trade brings about. At the same time, the evidence is clear that we need adequate social protection to enable those who need help to be looked after, to make sure that they have the capacity to continue to powerfully engage in society and in their community. All of these matters have been the subject of significant debate throughout the worldwide employer movement for decades, as a matter of fact, and it's not surprising that we'd be talking about them now in the context of trade, because now I think is the time to extend that conversation much more towards the WTO and the international trading system. As we move into our next normal from COVID, it will be important that we keep our foot on the accelerator of liberalizing trade. We know that an increase in global trade means more competitive economies, more innovation, cheaper goods and services for consumers, and better, higher skilled and higher paid jobs. All of that is just the tonic that the world needs right now. And yet we know that the global trading system's under threat. And sadly, of course, we've had the cancellation of this week's ministerial at the WTO, which might have helped move things along. I think it's vitally important that businesses and business organizations speak up for trade. And that's what this initiative is all about. And as I say, it's extremely welcome as a result. One particular thing I would emphasize is the need for the initiative not just to point at Geneva, although that's very important. What we're doing also needs to point at the engagement of employers and business organizations so that they feel more confident speaking up for trade and associated labour market settings to ensure that trade is successful for all in the context of their local economy and their local communities. Just last night, I was on a conference call with a number of African employers and business organizations, and they had a number of questions about the potential for them and their members to speak up for trade in this new post-COVID world. I think we should be answering that call. I think we should be building their capability, and I look forward to this new initiative, this new coalition, doing something very powerfully about that. Because at the end of the day, trade rules and norms are set in Geneva, but different countries and different communities also need to give their permission and their support to trade. Otherwise, it won't be successful in delivering the benefits that we know it can deliver. With that in mind, Business New Zealand and I personally look forward to supporting this initiative in any way we can. It's great it's here. Let's make the most of it. Thanks, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think that your engagement and the engagement of Business New Zealand, in many ways also because of your role also in many trade agreements, is going to be very important also for the future. Also, and as you said, there are many areas in which we can make the connections on social protection networks, but also on areas which has to do also with employment policies. I want also now to go to Marcus, and thank you again for joining us. Thank you for dedicating the time. I think that the European Union is an example of a powerful economic trade integration, but also with the important social and employment links. And the role that you have played in Business Europe and leading and participating and also influencing many of these integration processes is key and has been key. But also that goes beyond the European Union. It has to do also with the world trade integration or trade flows. So your input is also very, very relevant, and above all, also your engagement also in this initiative. Thank you, Marcos, for making the time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And let me first thank you for inviting us, for involving us, and very much for this initiative. And I think it has been echoed by many already, by Maria Fernanda, by Phil, that, I mean, it's key that we together as business organizations stand up for trade because it is under pressure, it is challenged, and this is why it's very important that we join forces across business and employee organizations around the world. It's good to see you again, Phil. Last time we met in New Zealand. Good to know that, let's say, the FTA we have in New Zealand is on a better way than currently with Australia. I know it's 1:30 in the morning, so and second, pleasure to see you, Angela. We normally always meet you on the Hill. We miss you on the Hill, of course, but it's very good to know you in Geneva, and a pleasure to reconnect with you here. So, well, I think it's crucial that we stand up for trade, but this means we need to stand up for the WTO. We had a good exchange with Dr. Ngozi 2-3 weeks ago involving our members, and we know what needs to be done. We know what is there, and we have seen in the pandemic and the disruption that there is a lot where business is key. I mean, we take up our responsibility for the economic recovery, for investing, for creating jobs, for innovating, for trying to fix the supply chains again, but we cannot do alone. We need a good, foreseeable, and reliable set of rules and enforceable rules. And therefore, of course, it's a pity that the 12th ministerial had to be postponed for the second time. At the same time, maybe this is also a chance to still make more progress, because before we actually come to the table, because I think we all had question marks on whether or not this ministerial could have been the big success we have been looking for this week. So maybe this will even give us a chance to keep on negotiating and to fix one or the other thing going on, and then let's take it as a positive, because of course this is still crunch time, because we need progress on so many things. I mean, we need reform, we need the dispute settlement system to work, we need the rules to be enforceable, of course, because we've seen that the fact that, of course, some of the rules are outdated, and at the same time that they are not enforceable or not fully enforceable at the time being, this has given an excuse to many to not follow them, to go unilaterally, and also to sometimes come up with an anti-trade agenda. This is, of course, something we need to counter. And as I say, regardless on whether or not the ministerial could happen this week, it is still crunch time for the WTO. Therefore, I really appreciate, Roberto, that you went on with this initiative, that we still have it, because I think the topics are still at the table, and I think we all have a responsibility to keep the momentum up on key issues, and let me mention 5 of them. So first, and this we all know, we urgently need a comprehensive reform of the WTO on all 3 functions. On all 3 core functions. On the negotiating functions, on the rules, we know that there's many rules which are outdated, starting with e-commerce, and on this we will need to reestablish the ability to negotiate. on monitoring capacity, very important, and has shown in the pandemic, and also on the ability to settle disputes between members, needless to say. The second point is we need to launch a trade and health initiative, because we've clearly seen in the pandemic there is a necessity. And there's points to address. First and foremost, of course, export restrictions, and I don't exclude the European Union. Improving transparency and finding pragmatic solutions to also improve the access to vaccines. But I would add, without putting the TRIPS agreement in total jeopardy. But we need to find progress here, because we have seen it is crucial that everybody has access to vaccines. The third point is, of course, the plurilateral initiatives. I think this is fundamental for the WTO agenda, because, of course, we would love to have all the new rules we need under the full WTO umbrella, but the truth is some of them we will need plurilateral initiatives to go forward, and to maybe then in the second stage have all the others following. And you all know the list: domestic regulation and services, and negotiations in the area of e-commerce. We've seen in the pandemic, and we see it today, how important digital is, and we really need to update our rules to be able to respond to this situation. And then, of course, the disciplines which have been touched upon in the famous trilateral, competitive neutrality, including industrial subsidies, the role of state-owned enterprises, all these things we will need to do progress. The fourth point is fighting against climate change, and we see this is urgent, and we think that trade can play a key role here in providing the whole world with sustainable solutions, goods, services, technologies, but also in leveling the playing field. I mean, we have seen that this is key. This will be even more important, and this is what we also need to do. And the last point, of course, is we, of course, need this agreement on fisheries subsidies, because we know that this is something we need to, I mean, first, we have been negotiating for 20 years. Second, this is something we need to give to the more developing countries. And then this is key to really have a balance in what we have on our way forward. So I really hope that the circumstances to have the 12th ministerial will come soon. But as I say, let's use the time well to continue to negotiate, to create a dynamic, and to hopefully, when it's able to happen, to have the breakthrough ministerial we had hoped for this week. And then maybe it's a blessing that we will have it in a couple of weeks or even in a couple of months. We will continue to do so. We are ready to support this initiative in every way possible. And just one thing, we will also issue a joint message tomorrow together with our friends from the US Chamber, from Kedanren, from the Brazilian CNI and the Canadian Chamber, to issue quite a bit, and then most of the points I have stressed today. So we will continue to push also on the level of the Global Business Coalition, of the P7 partnership, of the P20 partnership, but of course very much supporting this very initiative. Roberto, thanks again, and let's keep the dynamic on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I would like to, well, you mentioned several areas in which we need to make, to further strengthen the global conversations on trade. I would like to highlight one of them, which you refer to, which is health and trade, which is very much on the spot of everyone here. And also from IOE, we have been also pushing an important agenda to strengthen health at the workplace. But at the end of the day, that's also linked to trade and migration, but it's also linked to the need also to strengthen trade flows in a safe and also with a preventive culture manner. So that's an area where we can also, identify joint action in the very, very short term. Again, thank you for your inputs. We look forward also to strengthen our work, precisely in an area where Business Europe has always been very in a leading position. I want now also to thank Angela, and Angela, thank you for joining us. We already, I can say that you are a relatively newcomer to the WTO. We had a conversation, you and me, at the very beginning when you just, if I may use this word, landed in the Geneva scenario. I suppose that you have already had important time and intense training within the WTO, also to be very much involved in the different conversations that are taking place. But beyond that, I want to stress your role in previously also in the American administration, in the USA administration, precisely in areas that are very much linked also to trade and employment. I want also to thank the commitment not just of you, but also of Dr. Ngozi. She came also to join. She joined us also in our General Council. She very much stressed precisely this angle of employment, inclusiveness, SDGs, as a way forward also to push and to change the narrative. So your presence here with us, Angela, is also of great value, precisely to start this journey and this conversation and this joint action together. The floor is yours, and thank you for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Roberto, and it's nice to see old friends on the panel. So thank you very much for inviting me. Congratulations to the IOE on the launch of the Business Coalition for Trade, Employment, and Sustainable Development. This is an important and timely initiative that will help further strengthen the dialogue between the WTO and business, which is particularly important in the context of discussions on WTO reform. So it's a pleasure to be with you today, albeit virtually. So I've been asked to speak about the role of trade in promoting employment and sustainable development in the economic recovery from COVID, and how business can engage with the WTO. But I would like to start with what's been on the minds of many of us since last Friday, the WTO's decision to postpone, not cancel, but postpone the Ministerial Conference, or MC12, which was supposed to have started yesterday. We had to take this decision due to the appearance of the new COVID variant, which would have prevented some delegations from participating in the ministerial. And this raised concerns not only about the health and safety of our participants, but also about the inclusivity and fairness of the process, as well as the legitimacy of any potential outcomes. The reaction from our members was disappointed, but very supportive of the decision as the only option. And so many of them noted that we had been making much progress and had built strong momentum just within the last week. Now the question is, how do we maintain that momentum and build on it, as many of you referenced? Work must continue, and we must continue to keep the pressure on. We're hoping that with this extra time, negotiators will manage to close some of the remaining gaps. Some of you may have seen the letter of the chair and vice chairs of MC12 just issued a day or so ago, which proposes to convene the ministerial in March, if conditions permit, in person, to build on our progress and finalize key priorities, particularly fisheries subsidies and the response to the pandemic. This is now up to our members to decide, but we must maintain the momentum. The appearance of the new COVID variant highlights once again the importance and urgency of the work that we've been doing at the WTO, particularly in the area of access to vaccines and the intellectual property waiver question. Let me now turn to the overall issue of the role of international trade and the WTO as its guardian in the economic recovery from COVID, with a particular focus on employment and sustainable development. Global rules of trade embodied in the WTO agreements provide assurance and stability to economic actors across the world. On the one hand, producers and exporters know they can source components and raw materials from abroad, and that foreign markets will be open to their goods and services. On the other hand, consumers know they can enjoy a secure supply of finished products and services. This leads to a more prosperous and peaceful economic world. Moreover, trade has a positive impact on employment and jobs. Industries dependent on international trade are major employers in advanced economies, as well as in many developing ones. For example, in the EU, extra EU exports of goods and services support around 38 million jobs. In the US, 1 in 5 jobs is supported by trade. In developing countries that specialize in the production of labor-intensive goods, such as light manufacturing, trade creates jobs, including for unskilled workers. So this is large companies and small businesses as well. The importance of the rules-based trade has been further magnified by the COVID pandemic. According to our data, in 2020, the value of global trade in goods and services in nominal terms fell by 9.6%, while global GDP fell by 3.3%. This was the most severe recession since World War II. But the trading system has proved itself more resilient than many expected at the outset of the crisis. According to our latest forecast, the volume of global merchandise trade is predicted to grow by 10.8% in 2021, followed by a 4.7% rise in 2022. The global trading system has helped countries cope with the pandemic by facilitating access to critical medical supplies, food, and consumer goods. And WTO rules have slowed and even prevented countries from taking very damaging trade restrictive measures during the pandemic. Our trade facilitation agreement, although not designed with the pandemic in mind, has played an outsized role in worldwide recovery. Countries that have embraced and rapidly implemented trade facilitating measures and infrastructure have generally proven more resilient and adaptable. And it's the same with digital trade as well. Trade can be a powerful recovery mechanism, especially for many developing and least developed countries, which have limited ability to spur economic recovery through fiscal stimulus packages. Trade increases job opportunities and access for poor households to affordable goods and services. So trade will be at the heart of efforts to strengthen economic resilience and prepare for future crises. And it's central to building forward towards a greener, more inclusive, and digital recovery. Trade cooperation can improve the global economy's resilience to shocks by achieving more open markets and diversifying sources of supply. To make the global system better prepared for the current and future crises we may face, we also need a strong WTO that is equipped to face modern-day challenges. In the context of the economic downturn triggered by the pandemic, the WTO's mission is as important as ever: to use trade to raise living standards, create jobs, and foster sustainable development. But you know well that the last few years have been difficult for the WTO. We all agree that the WTO needs improvement, and MC12, whenever it is held, will be an important milestone on the path to reform. I'd like to conclude with a few words about how business can support the WTO and play a role in its reform. We can't take for granted that everyone believes in the value of trade and the rules-based multilateral trading system. If you value the WTO, then it's important to make the case that it's relevant and that it's worth improving and reinvigorating. And this was the point that Phil was making. Although the WTO is an intergovernmental organization, there are several ways in which businesses can promote their interests. First, business associations like yours are well placed to make outreach directly with decision makers and with the public at large. Position papers on WTO issues that many associations prepare are an effective way to make businesses' views known, and IOE really is I highlight the work that you all have done in this regard. Furthermore, I'd encourage you to participate in our annual public forum. This event regularly attracts over 1,500 representatives from civil society, academia, business, parliamentarians, and intergovernmental organizations. It provides a platform for discussing the latest developments in world trade and proposing ways of enhancing the multilateral trading system. Finally, our ministerial conferences usually include business events, the purpose of which is to develop private sector recommendations on priorities for the organization. And I hope to see many of you at the business forum of MC12 when it takes place. In thinking about WTO reform, we must demonstrate where we have been successful, be honest about where we have not, and be ambitious as to how we can improve it. In that discussion, business's views are important, and we count on your engagement. Business must be a voice for good, both on matters that are in your immediate interest, as well as broader issues like climate change, fisheries, and access to vaccines. So that concludes my remarks, and I wish you fruitful discussions and successful event and work as you launch now your new initiative. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Angela, for this insightful contribution. I also want to tell you that there is a specific question for you. I don't know whether you will be able to answer it before I give also the floor to the Vice Minister of Employment, Mr. Dalcolmo. Thank you also for joining us, Mr. Bruno. The question is, and the question comes from our Executive Director in the Bangladesh Business Organization, Farooq Ahmed, and he refers, what programmatic reform measures are being considered at this moment during the post-COVID era are being considered at this moment during the post-COVID era that the big players in WTO multilateral trade system will be more accommodative to allow required space for win-win negotiation among the advanced developing and LDC countries with greater inclusiveness. I mean, it's a long question, as you can see, but it's basically identifying what are the areas in which, and you refer to that right now, you need to improve based on the lessons learned, but also where you have, perhaps been not so effective in the past. I don't know whether you're willing to answer that now, or you prefer just to give the answer now.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I'm just looking at the question on the screen right now, the concept of placing some of the expectations and ideas in cold storage. What kind of reform measures can we take? And that's an issue under very active discussion right now, because I think members look at it in different ways. Over the last couple of weeks, members have been negotiating an outcome document, basically a ministerial declaration with a paragraph on reform, and trying to discuss what exactly that means. For some, reform means new rules to address some of the challenges that our rules, which were set some time ago, they just don't address. For others, reform means looking at dispute settlement and seeing whether or not there are changes, what changes should be made to make dispute settlement more effective so that the obligations in agreements are more meaningful. For others, the priority on reform is the question of how to deal with developing countries. What kind of special and differential treatment should be available that allows developing countries to catch up and to give them extra time. And the degree of that is something that is being debated. So I think the question of reform is front and center. Everyone talks about it. The DG ran on a campaign of reform. But one thing I would say, when people talk about the fact that the WTO needs reform, I think we have to keep in mind that the WTO is a member-driven organization. So it's not a monolith. It's made up of all of our members. So when we're saying the WTO needs reform, we have to consider really what that means in the context of our membership, where our members are coming from and how they want to change things to make the WTO more fit for purpose. But I do think that there is an understanding that that is a debate that needs to happen, and some specifics really have to be put down on the table as to how it will play out.
Oriented approach is a strong pillar of the WTO, and I can tell that also in comparison also with other international organizations. So that's precisely the way forward. Thank you again for your time. I want now to give the floor to Mr. Bruno Dal Colmo. And sorry, I don't speak Portuguese, just Spanish. And thank you again for making the time, for your commitment. We wanted to bring governments, and we have foreseen two governments, one from Brazil, an important player in trade agreement, but also with an employment angle. And I think that it was very pertinent also to have someone like you with a leading position in terms of employment reforms. Bruno, what's your perspective? How we can complement better trade integration, employment policies? How can we better make the case of trade integration for employment purposes? The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank Mr. Roberto Soares, Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers, for the invitation to speak on behalf of the government of Brazil in this important event involving the future of trade and employment in such challenging times. Brazil, as all countries in the world, was negatively affected by COVID-19 since the disease imposed social distancing measures that hampered normal economic activity. In order to minimize the negative impact, the Brazilian government put in place in a rapid manner measures that provided relief to Brazilian citizens. Especially important and under our realm of responsibility here at the Ministry of Labor, we established a short-time work scheme program that saved more than 12 million formal jobs through the reduction of working hours instead of termination of contracts. This was the biggest job support program in the history of the country, made in a transparent fashion and with the support of all political forces of the Brazilian Congress. As a result, workers earn from maintaining the bonds to their jobs and their income. Employers earn by protecting bonds with trained workers, and government and society benefit from the stability of the labor market and the cost savings, avoiding unnecessary expenses with unemployment insurance. The Brazilian government could not leave behind the millions of informal workers that made up a significant portion of our labor market, as is the case in many developing countries, especially in Latin America. An emergency aid program was established for more than 70 million citizens and informal workers, or about a third of the overall population. And we have made sure that women who are single mothers receive the benefit in double. This aid program has managed to avoid that the most vulnerable Brazilian became destitute. The Brazilian system of social security and labor has striven to adapt to current challenges and has broadened public services in the virtual domain. Our current modernization efforts make us enthusiasts of the digital and technological revolution. In such a large country as Brazil, the new technologies and their constant use by the population allow the state to be closer to citizens and facilitate their lives in order to stimulate economic activity and their well-being. Nowadays, Brazilian workers can demand unemployment benefits, denounce abuses, and consult legislation through mobile apps or via the internet. Employers can also access an online system to supply obligatory information to the government, vastly reducing red tape and the administrative burden on enterprises. During the pandemic, unemployment benefits continue to be provided without interruption, as it could be could be entirely done online. And now 95% of the benefits reach workers this way. More recently, we have finished a simplification process of our labor regulatory framework that managed to organize more than 1,000 dispersed labor regulations into only 15 regulations, now easily accessible to everyone, especially workers and small and medium-sized companies that before were hostages to the complexity of the system. As you can imagine, a government that has striven so hard to modernize itself and the country cannot be in favor of protectionist measures in trade. The current Brazilian government is a firm believer in free trade based in clear rules, because we believe free trade in the long run benefits all trading societies. Brazil has not instituted any measures that impedes trade after COVID-19, and quite the opposite. We continue in our effort to open up the economy and to search for more markets abroad for our exports. It is worth calling attention to our agricultural sector that has become the object of severe misunderstandings recently. Brazil is capable of exporting a diverse set of agricultural products because it is very productive and efficient, thanks not only to our natural resources, but also to science and to industriousness of our people. Our statistics show that this highly dynamic sector was responsible for the biggest growth in employment in 2020 and served as a counterpoint to the losses experienced by the service sector heavily impacted by the pandemic. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, Brazil is a case in point for the importance of trade for the employment in the age of COVID-19. The Brazilian government believes the World Trade Organization to be instrumental in discussions regarding the liberalization of trade of agricultural products, of course, taking into account all relevant parameters of environmental sustainability and labor rights. The current state of widespread protectionism regarding agricultural trade is a burden for developing countries that desperately need jobs for its citizens. Brazil, as you know, has one of the highest rates of adherence to fundamental conventions of the International Labour Organization. Labor rights that are enshrined into our constitution, a universal social protection system that is even stronger and more sustainable thanks to a recent pensions system reform, and a universal free at the point of access health system that has managed to totally immunize around 130 million citizens, more than 60% of the population at this point in time. Of course, trade does not do wonders alone. A successful country needs, beyond openness of trade, a stable, modern, and rational economic environment. We are building that in Brazil with decisive actions on cutting red tape, incentivizing public-private partnership in several sectors of the economy, especially infrastructure, and a fresh look at the new challenges of the post-COVID-19 world. Artificial intelligence and automation of jobs will reiterate the importance of permanent and lifelong provision of skills to workers, a priority of the Brazilian government as well. We are very close to announcing legislative proposals that will provide reskilling of younger and older workers in order to avoid the scarring effect caused by long-term unemployment, such as the one brought by COVID-19. An endeavor which is supported by the Brazilian national business and employer membership organizations. The IOE plays a fundamental role in combining the strengths of employers and business all over the world in fora such as the World Trade Organization and the ILO, where the contributions of the IOE bring a much needed rational approach to the discussions, and with which the views of the Brazilian government are highly coincidental. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for the invitation to participate in this important event. In the name of the Brazilian government, I wish you all the success to the Business Coalition for Trade, Employment, and Sustainable Development. You can count on Brazil as a friend and as a supporter. Thank you very much, Roberto. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, Bruno. I think that you have mentioned several angles in which the practice and experience and the measures that the government of Brazil is trying to strengthen precisely the social approach, also to avoid a kind of counterproductive protectionism flow also in many of the exchanges that we have. We also have been witnessing also how committed your government has been also in many of the discussions that we have had, and we are more than willing to engage with you to identify further action, also precisely to help to change this narrative. I would like now to give the floor to one important business organization of IOE. We are still waiting for the government, the Minister of Uganda. Apparently there are some important connectivity issues, and that's often the case also sometimes in many developing economies, and that's why we precisely have to push further the agenda of digital infrastructure. We are still waiting to see whether finally we can connect with the minister. But meanwhile, I would like to give the floor to Cas Corvidia. Cas is the Executive Director of Business South Africa. Is the most representative organization in South Africa, very, very active in many domains, of course, in the domain of employment, but also with a clear vision of how important it is to strengthen the connection within social policies and employment policies and trade policies. Okay, so thank you, Cas, also for joining us. You also have a very, very busy agenda, and we are more than looking forward to hear your inputs and also to work together on this area.
Thank you, Roberto, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, wherever you may be sitting. Let me just start by, certainly from a South African point of view, and I would think a sort of emerging country point of view. Trade is a critical area, as one of our speakers have said, that for emerging countries, developing countries, trade is a critical part, critical element of job creation, of industrial policy, and the way we grow our economy. So trade is obviously a critical area. We are in the process of activating an African free trade agreement that was signed a couple of years ago. One of the purposes of that is to actually increase intra-African trade as well, because intra-African trade is pretty low relative to other trading blocks or economic blocks. And so we would want to certainly engage the WTO. And I like what one of our earlier speakers said, that the WTO of the future, to look at how, as a continent that has a great deal of potential, but has significant problems, but that if we work well within the world system, world trade system, but also get the WTO and others to recognize that the world trade system is not homogeneous. There's a system for developed countries and there's a system for developing countries. And I think one of the roles of the WTO should be to see how we bring those closer together and how we also develop mechanisms to address particular needs of developing countries. And certainly, as the biggest business organization on the African continent, we see that as a critical role for BUSA in conjunction with our other partners on the continent. We would certainly be supportive of the IOE as representing employers globally to play a critical role in trade and to develop guidelines, help develop mechanisms to enable national trade association, national employer bodies to actually play a critical role in promoting trade, in positioning trade as an important element of the economy, and in interacting with the WTO. We will obviously do that as South Africa nationally and with other people. I mean, we're talking to some business organizations in Europe and have done some work with them in the past to actually send some documentation to the WTO, and we will continue doing that. But we believe that the IOE has a critical role to play here. One of our previous speakers also talked about reskilling and retraining and how important that is. And in the area of trade, where the South African economy is, while it's a diversified economy that's globally connected, it will struggle to engage with a 4IR economy because of the lack of skills and because of the reality that a significant part of our workforce just does not have the sort of skills to engage with that sort of an economy. So I think that is critical. I think reskilling and retraining is also critical, certainly for South Africa. And again, one of our speakers touched on that in the whole climate change debate. When I spent a few days at COP, and while we as South Africa have committed to pretty ambitious targets, we need to do that within the context of a just transition pathway, because we've got to reskill not just workers, but whole communities that had become dependent on fossil fuel, and reskill them to actually play a role in an economy that's based on cleaner and greener energy. So I think the whole area of skilling as part of the trade debate is critical for us. Also, post-COVID, we're beginning to see a sort of trend towards protectionism in some countries. And that too has an impact. And so we too, looking at how we can jack up local manufacturing and localization, but to do that in a way that we ensure that our local manufacturing capacity is geared up to participate in what we believe will be an increase in intra-African trade, but also to participate in trade in a new economy post-COVID. So I think those are some of the critical issues we're dealing with. And so we're very supportive of this initiative. We believe that collaboration through the IOE between employer bodies globally in the area of trade and in interacting and positioning employer bodies with the WTO is a crucial element, and we are very supportive of that. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cas. I think your input, your contribution is also of importance for us for many reasons, also because of the role of also that the business community in South Africa plays. You refer also to something which is really crucial, and is the skills needs also, which are also linked to many trade flows and trade integration tendencies and trends. I was discussing with some of you what could be the way forward also for this initiative, and we came with some ideas that we will share with you, and I would like us to advance some of them to you, precisely to start thinking ahead. One of them would be to have regular exchange with WTO, with among ourselves, business community, but also with WTO and other international organizations on trade developments and their impact on employment and sustainable development. And this exchange will try also to identify also drivers and lessons. We were also thinking also as a way forward of designing a kind of good communication campaign to strengthen precisely the employment and social inclusiveness gains of trade integration process. Beyond that, one idea that also came is to work on a kind of guidance on drivers that have made a difference, but based on recent experience of trade integration agreement. In IOE, we have also worked on the area of social clauses in trade agreements, and that's something that we also can put onto the table to help also to change this dynamic in terms of integration trade process. And also we have also developed some important initiatives on supply chains, on global supply chains, whenever it goes to respect of fundamental principles of right of work, and especially in the area of child labor, forced labor. So those are also areas where we can also put in common, some initiatives that can also help to change this logic and to avoid a very negative protectionism trend. I'm just launching that to you, not to have a discussion right now, but also to start thinking, and I'm looking now to Maria Fernanda, and I think Marcus has already left, but as a kind of way forward also to see how we can strengthen our cooperation. But we have several questions. We have 3 questions. Some of them are difficult to answer because we are raising issues related to trade trends, bilateral trade trends. Some others are perhaps easier, but we are going to answer them after this panel because we don't have much time. I will now give the floor to the president of IOE, who has kindly joined us and who is already ready also to give some important final remarks. Again, thank you, Michelle, for joining us. Thank you also to you for joining so early in your timing. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberto. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me start by saying how pleased I am that today we are launching the Business Coalition for Trade, Employment, and Sustainable Development. Trade and market openness have historically gone hand in hand with better economic performance, job creation, and development. In recent decades, trade has expanded remarkably, completely transforming the global economy. Global trade has contributed to the creation of jobs in developed and developing economies alike and has helped bring millions out of poverty. The current challenges confronting trade disruption amid COVID-19 and the high demand for jobs for recovery require more dynamic and sustainable environments for trade and investment and for enterprises to create more and better jobs. The impact of global trade on people depends both on national policy settings of the countries in which they live and on the nature and degree of international economic cooperation. Deepening our joint activities with fellow organizations and relevant stakeholders is more crucial than it ever was. In order for the gains of trade to be maximized and equitably distributed, stakeholders need to act across many fronts simultaneously. This implies working across silos and taking a much more integrated policy approach, both domestically and internationally. Solutions need to be found in both domestic and multilateral institutions to realize the benefits of the multilateral trading system, to contribute to increasing global welfare, and to promote better employment outcomes. Bringing together businesses through the IOE and trade actors through the WTO will add value. Domestically, a proper infrastructure for dynamic trade needs to be in place. Strong institutions need to be present. Rigidities in the labor markets and financial markets, as well as restrictive regulations, need to be tackled. The role of the private sector in framing policy for this to happen is key. An integrated policy approach requires trade policy to become action-oriented. This means that social partners should be involved in national policy making, as they're the only ones directly impacted by both domestic and international policies governing the terms. Business and employer membership organizations in particular are well placed to participate in national policy making by providing up-to-date information and data that can support empirical policy making. In addition, they can bring experience and expertise from businesses operating across borders and addressing the barriers of trade and investment. On the multilateral level, international cooperation and trade liberalization efforts carried out by the WTO are also necessary. An enabling environment for trade and business can only be developed through our collective efforts. The potential of trade for a rich job recovery requires full engagement of the private sector as the main source of jobs. Launching this initiative constitutes a clear commitment from business for recovery, for building forward better, and for leveraging all that the WTO represents, which is improving people's lives through raising standards of living, ensuring full employment, increasing real outcome, and expanding global trade in goods and services while allowing for the optimal use of the world's resources. The initiative we're launching today provides a blueprint for strong collaboration and support for employment growth and sustainable development through trade that is underpinned by the multilateral rules. Moreover, the Business Coalition for Trade, Employment, and Sustainable Development will promote and coordinate the efforts of business and employer membership organizations and companies of all sizes and characters for sustainable development through trade, as well as to strengthen dialogue between business and the WTO and other international trade organizations. So, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is important for the multilateral trading system to be more visibly and vocally supported by the global business community to promote the positive social impact of trade. The International Organization of Employers and its global membership of more than 150 national business and employer organizations representing 50 million companies stand fully committed to these efforts. We look forward to a strengthened and a more dynamic collaboration with the WTO. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you to all of you for joining us. As I told before, as I mentioned before, we are going to share with you some kind of follow-up action, and we are more than willing to build a collective effort, an effective collective effort together with you. Thank you to all the other business colleagues. Maria Fernanda, thank you for joining all the event. Cass, Phil, but also all those who participated before. Unfortunately, we did not manage to have the Minister of Uganda connected. He still have connectivity issues, but we look forward also to connect with other governments in the coming months. Thank you for your time. Thank you for also your commitment. We look forward to hear from you once we forward you the proposals.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Have a nice
Thank you.
evening.
Bye, everybody.
Nice
Bye.
to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye.